This is our presentation, Redline's Impacts on Access to Facilities in Boston. So just to give a little bit of background on why we started this presentation, so we all three of us were in the same AP history class this past year, and one of the most intriguing parts of this class that we had studied was learning about the development of the United States post-World War II. And I think something that we all found very interesting was the development of suburbia, as well as the changing economic and cultural values of Americans during this time period. So when we had the opportunity to conduct this research, we wanted to delve deeper into this development in the United States post-World War. And one thing that we found really interesting was after the World War II happened, there was a time in which people were experiencing very increased economic development, and they had a lot of time and money in their pockets. And because of this development, people were able to move towards the suburbs into places like Littleton, Acton, and other parts of the suburban Boston area. And this developed multiple different classifications for areas in Boston as people started to buy up various properties in the city. So this is what we wanted to explore further, and we dove into understanding how access to various recreational and leisure facilities changed as a result of these new homeowner loan corporation that was developed in Boston.
So redlining was a term that was first introduced in Boston by the Federal Home Loan Agency, and this was introduced in the 1930s, and what it did is that in Boston's area, it classified it into 4 different parts. There was A, B, C, and D, and these parts were labeled based on racial segregations or economic characteristics. And not only did the separation just remain to economic and ethnic races, but it also determined access to mortgages, infrastructure, and public investment. So looking deeper into this, it's not just the housing infrastructure that these created, but it was also the aftermath of the World War II and the different recreational facilities that it targeted. So looking deeper into this, communities of A and B of these neighborhoods, they really focused on affluent, white, middle to high class families, which had a lot of money in their pockets, and they were able to afford these nice houses in like the outskirts of Boston, so the suburban area. Compared to that, the C and D neighborhoods mainly focused on immigrant families, Jews, Irish people, and Black African Americans. And they were forced into the heart of Boston, where it's very crowded and it was hard to get more recreational facilities in this area. So whereas A and B neighborhoods flourished and they had swimming pools, golf courses, and so many recreational facilities and transportation, that was not the same for C and D neighborhoods.
Okay, and so with the differences that come in population and population characteristics, that equals an impact on the investments that each category gets. So as we see in the A and B areas, which included places like Newton, Brookline, and the Chestnut Hill area, those areas got higher investment from public and private corporations. So as their high ratings on the HOLC maps, the infrastructures that were funded had a higher rate and they had more private development. However, in the C and D areas, which included towns like Roxbury, Dorchester, South Boston, and East Boston, more in the inner city, they received minimal funding, and most of these residents relied on small municipal parks, so public parks, and they relied on schoolyards as a form of recreation. And so as a result, investment inequality shaped access to their recreational facilities. And this table shows us an overview of the economic and social differences. And so Diyansha already mentioned the differences in population, but we see differences in the incomes that each area has. So in the A areas, which are categorized as some of the best areas with more affluent and wealthy families, especially white American families, average incomes were around $6,000 and even above. Whereas B, which was also one of the best and still desirable, the average income was around $3,000 to $5,000. However, there's a difference when we see the C and D areas, which were categorized as declining and hazardous. So in the C areas, average incomes range from only $1,200 to $3,000, whereas the D areas, their starting salary or starting average income was only $500 compared to the $3,000 starting income in the B areas, which shows the stark differences in the average incomes.
And these are some of the documents that we were able to analyze. So we used a source called, that was developed by the University of Richmond, and they gathered together all the various maps that were developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And what they did was they would send out surveyors into various parts of Boston, and they had these slips where they would classify the areas based off of very subjective opinions. And for example, some of the snippets that they would write for A and B areas would be modern housing, new development. And they would even talk about the concentration of foreign-born populations in those areas. So A and B areas were constantly written as 0% or anything below 10%. However, when you look at the classifications for the C and D slips, you can see that they start listing higher concentrations of foreign-born populations, and that significantly influences the way that they describe the areas. They describe C areas as in a declining mode, and they describe D areas as dilapidated and hazardous.
Okay, and so what we did to look at our research, each of us looked into different types of recreational facilities. So personally, I looked into golf courses and winter facilities. So starting off with the golf courses, golf was a sport, especially in the United States, that was participated and played by affluent white American families. And as Anika mentioned, since American families had more time on their hands after the war, golf was one of those sports that they could put more time and money into. And we see that in the A and B areas, there was around 5 total sites in the places that I looked at, which included Newton and Brookline. These facilities included Brayburn Country Club, Woodland Golf Club, the Commonwealth Country Club, Charles River Country Club, and namely the Country Club in Brookline. And so the differences between the A, B, and the C and D golf courses was mainly the type. So in the A and B, it was mainly private and elite golf courses because they had the country club, which included luxurious amenities, and many of the people that went here were affluent families, so they had more money to put into the country clubs and more time to put in as well. Whereas the C and D, it was municipal, meaning that it was public. So in all the areas that I looked at, which included Roxbury, Dorchester, and the inner Boston area, there was only one, and that was just the Franklin Park golf course, which is public to all of the residents in the inner city of Boston. So just a quick analysis that I had on the side was that around 83% of the golf facilities were located in the white suburbs, in that the private clubs excluded the working class and minority residents of Boston because of membership fees and because of their locations. And secondly, I looked at winter facilities, and so mainly I looked at ice skating. Ice skating became really popular, especially in the Northeast, because in the North we have a long winter period compared to our summer period. And because of that, it's easier for people to do ice skating, and companies actually found it easier to hold ice skating rinks because it was easy revenue, since all you have to do for ice skating is buy the skates and you can go for as long as you want. And so that's why ice skating became really popular. But then what happened was, I read that in the 40s they actually had some weather issues apparently. So they didn't have as much snowfall as necessary to hold natural ice rinks on lakes or ponds. So what companies started doing is building artificial ice rinks. And what they did is that in A and B, they already had 4 areas by the end of the 30s, whereas in C, they only had 3. But what really happened was how many more artificial rinks they were proposing to build. And so in Newton and Brookline, and Milton, they proposed 4 more. They plan to finish building them by the end of the 40s and hopefully finish the project by 1954. And so in total, that would have given them 8 recreational or ice skating sites. Whereas in C, they only had the funds to propose 2 more artificial rinks. That would have given them 5 in total. So almost 66% of the proposed new ice rinks were mainly in the A and B areas, so the suburbs. And the suburban residents gained formal and funding rinks, while the inner city areas mainly relied on natural pond and natural resources that they could make themselves. And so quickly, just looking at investment patterns, in total for the ice rinks, and this is all areas in Boston, so the suburbs and the inner city, in total there was around $3.3 million total investment that was planned by the state. And so each rink, no matter where it was, the estimated price was going to be $275,000 per rink because of construction costs and all. But the main difference was in how much each type of area invested into it. So we see that in the A and B areas, they invested around $1 million because they had the private funding for that. Whereas in the C and D areas, they could have only invested around $500,000, so half of the price. And that just shows the difference in the types of funding that they received. And also for golf courses, again, there was around similar numbers, so around $3 million of total investment by private funding again. But the lower income Boston residents were effectively excluded because of the cost and because of the distance between such areas.
So as Laasya mentioned, she focused on golf courses and ice skating rinks. And for my portion of the research, I focused on green spaces, which can be classified as parks, reservations, beaches, and boulevards, and as well as pool and swimming pool areas or swimming areas in general. And so just a little bit of background knowledge that's necessary for this portion of the research is to understand the difference between MDC and municipally classified areas. So MDC, when I mention MDC, I'm referring to something that's called the Metropolitan District Commission. And that is a statewide agency that implemented various recreational facilities across Boston. And anything I describe as municipal is a local or citywide institution. So as I mentioned, I looked at green spaces and swimming areas. And these tables focus mainly on the green spaces. And I wanted to just highlight the various disparities between the A, B, and C areas. So in the A areas, they had around 14 total green spaces, and there were about 10 total municipal facilities and 4 total MDC facilities. And as I had previously mentioned, of those classification slips, they classified A areas as 0% foreign-born families, as well as 0% infiltration. So the ways that these A, B, and C areas were classified depended on both the existing foreign-born families as well as the potential for more families to move in. So A and B areas, as you can see, clearly show that there is no existing foreign-born families, as well as none that are expected to come into the area. So like I mentioned, there were about 14 total green spaces in the A classified areas. And for the B classified areas, there's about 19 total. And there's 18 municipal facilities and 1 MDC facility. And when we're looking at the C and D areas, we can see about 15 total for the C areas in terms of green spaces, as well as 23 for the D classified areas. And as you can see, the differences between the C and D areas is that the C area is classified as between 30 to 40% of foreign-born families currently, and infiltration is possible. And they also list the various types of families that have potential to infiltrate these areas. For C, it includes a few Jewish, Italian, and lower-class families. And for D classified areas, it includes both African American and Italian families, and it has around 50 to 60% foreign-born families living in that area at the time. And one thing that is interesting that I found throughout my research is that in terms of the A and B areas, there was actually less municipal facilities in the A and B areas in comparison to the C and D areas. And that actually came across as very surprising because I had expected that there would be a higher number of municipal facilities in the heavily funded parts of Boston, but what I didn't realize is that these are publicly funded facilities. So public funding would go towards C and D areas, but the amount of private funding that A and B areas received is not even an estimated number I could find, because people would invest their own money into building their own pools, building their own public green spaces, and often these C and D classified areas were often very poorly maintained in comparison to A and B areas. So I delved into a little bit of analysis here about these various areas. There is a transition pattern that is shown between the B and the C areas, where you can see how B areas are classified as still desirable, while C areas show a decline towards hazardous areas. And I think this is a point that I found interesting because the state funding actually went towards the A and B areas in comparison to the C and D areas, because the MDC facilities were there were more MDC facilities in A and B areas in comparison to the C and D areas. And although D areas, as I mentioned, had a higher number of municipal parks, these parks would often be very, very small. So any spaces that they found as green parks, they would just call it a municipal facility to make it seem as if there were, make it seem as if there was a large number of green spaces when there actually, in reality, there wasn't. And as I mentioned, income patterns, as we've highlighted before, declined based on the area classification. So A areas had a higher income, whereas D and C areas had a lower income. And in terms of swimming pools and swimming facilities, I actually found this really, this has been like a very personal research interest of mine, because in the past year I've actually spent a lot of time looking at swimming pool development in Littleton, and I looked at that also development happening in Boston. And one thing that I found was that the A and B areas, as I previously mentioned, had less public facilities, swimming facilities, but they had a large number of private swimming facilities, which was not highlighted in the map that I analyzed. Whereas the C and D areas had high pool development. And I had actually wondered why this was the case. And I read a source called Contested Waters that described why there was a higher number of pools in C&D areas. And this was attributed to pre-existing notions about foreign-born families. They actually started to build more pools in cities because they wanted to keep kids off the streets. So they would keep building more public facilities, including swimming pool areas and C&D areas, to try and keep kids occupied during the summer times. But there actually was signs of segregation happening in these pools, as people would not go visit areas in more heavily concentrated foreign-born family areas. They wouldn't go visit their municipal pools. So families started to build their own private pools in the A and B classified areas.
So when researching transportation and the effect of redlining on transportation, I was able to connect it back to my research that I did in Littleton. So in Littleton, I was able to research Ned Sanderson. He was an adolescent, a teenager adolescent, living from a white affluent family in Littleton during the time period. And I was able to make this connection because he was a teenager that was really into transit and transportation. And for his jobs and opportunities like that, he used to come into Boston. So it was really nice having like a white kid that was able to tell his experiences. Like he wrote it in a diary. So he was able to say his experiences in Boston and how he was able to transport from Littleton to Boston. And I could compare that to Black immigrants and see how everyone's opportunities really differed based on their social class and status. So this really showed me that mobility in the mid-20th century was not neutral, but it was rather a mechanism of privilege shared by your social class, geography, and policy. So just going into this, so in the core communities of A and B, we saw that they were really occupied by white elite residents, and this consisted of Beacon Hill and Black Bay. And so what this really represents is that these families had close access to Green Line and the Red Line, which is transit rails. And this meant they were close to Boylston, Arlington, and Charles. And they were also in close proximity of the highway, of the Storrow Highway and the Massachusetts Turnpike, which meant that they had more access to these transportation than compared to C and D, which included Roxbury and immigrant-heavy populated places. And their only access was trolley lines, and their closest access was the Orange Line, which was very heavily crowded, which made it almost impossible to go anywhere during in the middle of Boston, as well as there was very insane heavy reliance on these streetcars and buses, which made it hard for transit. But this wasn't just a thing about transportation. A big thing to note was that the A and B residents, because of this extended transportation, they had access to downtown jobs. They were able to get places and provide opportunities for their families. But for C and D, they were unable to get to transit, which made it hard and difficult for them to provide for their families because they weren't able to access these same recreational facilities as A and B communities. As Ned was talking about in his diary, he talked about how him and his brother used to go out in their automobile during this time when they were teens and spend time away from family doing different recreational activities. He talked about skiing, going to the pool, and when he was actually getting recruited for the troop, he talked about going to Boston a lot in the train. What's interesting is that where Ned lived in Littleton, he was right next to the Home Depot, which is right next to the train line in Littleton. So he had very close access to the train line. So as we can see, what this means is that they had a lot of free time. Touching base on what Anika said before, a quick statistic is that in 1926, Massachusetts men worked for around 49 hours a week, but then compared to that, in the 1950s, this decreased to 35 hours, which is a 14-hour difference. And this leisure time was big. Families could spend more time with their kids and going places. But this only benefited middle to white affluent families because only 60% of white families in Boston had access to cars, whereas compared to the less than 15% of Black families that own cars. And this just shows the discrepancy in Black and white families. Reflecting that, one other thing that I'd like to mention is that not only did transportation affect people going and transiting, but it also affected their home infrastructure. If you would look at a white or A and B neighborhood during this time period, you would see that their houses have garages, which I know is obviously every house has a garage. But the thing is that in C and D communities, their houses were so tiny and congested, they didn't even have access to a garage because people knew that based on where they were located, they probably didn't have a car. So not only did this affect how they transported from one place to another during this time period, but it also affected recreational facilities and transit that were added after World War II. For example, the inner belt, which is a highway, it's I-695, and the center artery, which is like an elevated highway, it was made into the heart of Boston. And this is where Roxbury and majority of the immigrants lived during this time period. So adding this creation and new developments for transit ruined multiple homes in Roxbury, which made it impossible for immigrants, number one, to get anywhere because their homes were being destroyed for the benefit of A and B communities. So this helped us analyze that for privileged white suburban residents, it was more possible for them to access more places, more opportunities for work and just recreational facilities compared to urban black and immigrant residents. The infrastructure decisions such as highways and commuter rails and investment actively reinforced racial and economic inequalities that was faced, limiting mobility and access to opportunities for marginalized neighborhoods such as the A and B versus the C and D communities. And this really shows the contrast between the suburban, because the A and B communities were suburbia of Boston compared to the urban part of Boston, which was C and D communities, which had less access to long-term urban inequality.